The cold had a way of settling into your bones before you even noticed it was there. That was the thing about Chicago in late October. It didn't arrive like a storm. It crept in slowly, through the gaps in your jacket, through the thin soles of shoes that weren't made for pavement, through the silence of a night that had no interest in being kind to you. Charlotte had been sitting on the concrete step outside the Meridian Tower for 3 hours before she admitted to herself that she had nowhere else to go. She hadn't planned this. That was the part that humiliated her most. Not the cold, not the stares from the doorman across the street, not even the slow drain of her phone battery as she scrolled through contacts she couldn't bring herself to call. It was the fact that she hadn't seen it coming. She, who prided herself on reading situations, on knowing when something was about to shift, had walked straight into the worst week of her life with her eyes wide open and her guard completely down. 7 days ago, she had a job. A good one, actually. Assistant event coordinator at Linden & Voss, a firm that handled private corporate events for clients who didn't like to be named publicly. The pay was steady. The work was detail-oriented in a way that suited her brain, and her supervisor, Dana, had told her just 3 months ago that she was being considered for a senior position. Charlotte had believed that. She'd bought new work shoes because of it. Then the firm lost a major contract. Then the restructuring began. Then Dana stopped making eye contact in the hallway. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon that smelled like burnt coffee and bad news, Charlotte found a termination letter on her desk with 2 weeks' severance and a form to sign. She'd signed it. She didn't know why. Some part of her was still operating on autopilot, still being professional, still nodding and thanking people who had just dismantled her carefully built stability in under 10 minutes. The apartment came next. She'd been subletting from a colleague, Marcus, who she'd known since her first week at the firm. When Marcus heard about the layoffs, he panicked. His lease was already fragile, built on the assumption that Charlotte's contribution covered nearly half his rent. He'd given her 2 weeks, same as the firm. She suspected they hadn't coordinated it, but the symmetry felt cruel regardless. 2 weeks had become 5 days, then 3. Then she was standing in front of the Meridian Tower with one large duffel bag, a laptop case, and the specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from lack of sleep, but from making too many decisions with no good options. She knew someone who lived here. That was the truth of it, the part she'd been circling around for hours without landing on directly. She knew someone on the 14th floor, and she had his number saved under a name she'd changed 3 times because she didn't know what to call him. Hak Jin. She'd met him 4 months ago through work, one of those events Linden & Voss organized for clients who didn't like to be named. A private dinner at the Aldrich Room, 40 guests, black tie, the kind of event where the floral arrangements cost more than her monthly rent, and the guests arrived in vehicles with tinted windows. Charlotte had been running logistics that night, clipboard in hand, earpiece in, moving through the room like she was invisible because that was exactly what her job required. She hadn't been invisible to him. She remembered noticing the shift in the room before she noticed him specifically. A kind of tightening in the air near the east entrance, the way the catering staff suddenly straightened without being told to, the way 2 men in dark suits repositioned themselves near the door with the quiet efficiency of people who did that kind of thing without thinking. And then he had walked in. Hak Jin didn't announce himself. He never did, she'd later come to understand. He simply existed in a room, and the room reorganized itself around him. He was younger than she'd expected for someone treated with that level of deference. Late 20s, maybe 30. Dark suit, white shirt, open 1 button too many, the ink on his neck visible even across the room. His face was composed in a way that didn't read as cold exactly, but as something more deliberate than warmth. He looked like a man who had decided, long ago, what he would and wouldn't allow himself to show. Charlotte had looked away immediately. That had been her first instinct. Don't look, stay invisible, do your job. Her second instinct, 30 minutes later, was that he was watching her. Not obviously. Nothing about him was obvious. But she'd felt it the way you feel a draft from a window you can't see. A persistent, directional awareness that something was oriented toward you. When she finally glanced up from her clipboard, she found him across the room in conversation with two other men, apparently absorbed, and yet his eyes had moved to her face with a precision that suggested he'd known exactly when she would look. She'd looked away again. Her hands had not been entirely steady for the rest of the evening. He'd approached her near the end of the night, when the guests were thinning and she was tallying something on her tablet near the side corridor. He hadn't introduced himself. He didn't need to. She'd already matched his face to the guest list. He'd simply stood beside her and said quietly, "You run a good room." 4 words. She'd replayed them more times than she would ever admit. Over the following weeks, there had been 2 more events where his name appeared on the private guest list. Each time, she'd told herself the awareness she felt was professional caution. Nothing more. Each time, he'd found a moment. Brief, never inappropriate. Always somehow private despite the crowded rooms, to say something small that stayed with her longer than it should have. Then he'd asked for her number. Not in a way that felt like a request she could easily decline. Not threatening, not pressuring. Just very quiet and very certain. Like a man who was accustomed to asking for things he already knew he would receive. She'd given it to him. She hadn't fully understood why until she was already home. They had talked. Carefully at first, then less carefully. He'd taken her to dinner once, a small Korean restaurant in Wicker Park, where they'd been seated in a back room she suspected was not available to the general public. He'd ordered for both of them without asking, and she'd started to object and then tasted the food and decided it wasn't worth the argument. He'd almost smiled at that. Almost. That had been 6 weeks ago. Since then, calls, sometimes late. Brief and dense with the kind of meaning that lived between sentences. She still didn't fully understand what they were to each other. She wasn't sure he'd let her define it even if she tried. And now she was sitting on the concrete outside his building with a duffel bag and no plan. Because she had exhausted every other option she was willing to use, and the October wind had stopped being polite about 20 minutes ago. She was not going to go in. That was what she told herself. She was going to sit here a little longer, figure something out, call a hostel, find a 24-hour diner, something. She was not going to walk into that lobby and ask for him like she was a problem he needed to solve. She pulled her jacket tighter. The duffel bag was doing nothing useful as a windbreak. 40 minutes later, she was still there. The lobby doors opened at 11:47 p.m. She knew because she'd checked her phone for the time, mostly to have something to look at. And a man stepped out. He wasn't the doorman. He was wearing a dark jacket over a dark shirt, and he had the kind of stillness in his face that Charlotte had come to associate, in the past few months, with a specific category of person. He looked at her once. Just once. Then he stepped back inside without a word. Charlotte stared at the closed door. Something cold moved through her that had nothing to do with the wind. 3 minutes passed. The door opened again. The man who stepped out this time was not the same one. He was taller, broader, with a scar along his jaw that caught the lobby light for just a second before he positioned himself to the left of the door, with the practiced stillness of someone who had stood in doorways like this many times before. He didn't speak to her. He didn't look at her with curiosity or pity or any of the expressions she might have expected from someone who had just found a woman sitting on a concrete step with a duffel bag at midnight. He simply stood there, waiting. Charlotte felt the weight of it before she understood what it meant. Then the door opened a third time, and the lobby light stretched across the pavement in a long, warm rectangle, and Hakjin walked out. He was wearing a dark sweater, no jacket, like the cold hadn't occurred to him or had simply decided not to apply to him. His eyes found her immediately, not scanning, not searching, just landing directly on her face with that unnerving precision she had never quite gotten used to. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they've already been thinking about, like she wasn't a surprise. like he'd already done the math on whatever this was and arrived at the answer before she had. Charlotte stood up. She didn't know why. Some reflex of dignity, maybe. Some insistence on not being looked at while sitting on the ground with her bag like lost luggage. He stopped 2 feet in front of her. His gaze dropped to the duffel bag, then back to her face. He said nothing for a moment that lasted longer than was comfortable. "How long?" he said. It wasn't a question exactly. It was the shape of one. "I wasn't going to come in," she said, because that was the most honest thing she could offer, and she needed him to know she hadn't come here expecting to be rescued. I needed a minute to think." "How long have you been out here, Charlotte?" The way he said her name did something to her composure that she couldn't afford right now. She pressed her lips together. "A few hours." Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically. His face didn't do dramatic, but there was a tightening around his eyes, a stillness that became somehow stiller, like a surface that had stopped pretending to be calm and was now simply being something else entirely. "A few hours?" he repeated. "I'm fine. I was going to figure something." "Come inside." 2 words. No inflection that she could argue with, no pity that she could push back against. Just that quiet, absolute certainty that she had come to recognize as the primary register of everything he said. He didn't ask. He didn't plead. He made statements that had the structural weight of decisions, and then he waited for the world to agree with them. Charlotte picked up her bag. She hated how quickly she did it. The lobby was warm in a way that made her realize how cold she'd actually been. The cold had been so gradual that she'd stopped registering it, and now the heat hit her all at once, and she felt it in her fingers, and in the back of her jaw, and in her eyes, which she blinked twice because she absolutely was not going to cry in the lobby of the Meridian Tower while Hawkjean's security held the elevator door. He took the duffel bag from her shoulder without asking. She almost said something. She let it go. The elevator ride was silent. She stared at the floor indicator. He stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, not touching her, just present in that way of his that made the air around him feel different from other air. The man with the scar had stayed in the lobby. They were alone. On the 14th floor, the hallway was empty and very quiet, carpeted in something dark that absorbed the sound of her footsteps. He unlocked the apartment with a keypad, 4 digits she didn't try to see, and held the door. She had been here once before, the dinner invitation that had briefly extended into a late evening, enough time to form an impression of the space. It was large and deliberately spare, the kind of apartment that communicated wealth not through excess but through restraint. Clean lines, dark furniture, city lights visible through floor-to-ceiling windows that ran the length of the living room. A single floor lamp burned low near the couch. The rest was shadow and skyline. He set her bag near the entrance without ceremony and moved toward the kitchen. Charlotte stood in the middle of the room and felt, acutely, the contrast between where she'd been 40 minutes ago and where she was now, and she wasn't sure how to hold both things at once. "You didn't eat," he said from the kitchen. Not a question again. She opened her mouth to say she was fine. "Not really," came out instead. The sound of the refrigerator. The quiet movement of someone who knew exactly where everything was in their own space. She drifted toward the window because she needed something to look at that wasn't him, and the city obliged. Chicago at midnight. All that amber light suspended above the dark grid of streets. The lake invisible, but present somewhere beyond the east edge of everything. He brought her food, something simple, rice and a portion of what smelled like doenjang jjigae, reheated from what must have been an earlier meal. He set it on the low table near the couch and sat across from it in the single chair, his forearms resting on his knees, watching her. "You don't have to watch me eat," she said. "I'm not watching you eat. You're looking directly at me while I eat. That's different." She wasn't sure it was, but she ate anyway, because she was hungrier than she'd allowed herself to feel. And the food was warm and good, and she was tired of performing composure. She ate most of it before she spoke again. "I lost my job," she said, "and the place I was staying. It was connected to work, the arrangement. So." She shrugged, and immediately felt the shrug was insufficient for the scale of what she was describing, and then felt angry at herself for caring about that. "I have savings. I was going to stay somewhere tonight and start making calls tomorrow. I wasn't coming here to ask you for anything." He was quiet for a moment. "Why did you come here then?" The question was gentle enough that it was worse than if it had been sharp. She looked down at the bowl in her hands. "I don't know. I'd been sitting out there for a while and I was cold and She stopped. Tried again. "I knew you were here. That was the only thing I knew for certain tonight." He didn't respond to that immediately. She felt the silence as a kind of pressure, not uncomfortable, just dense with something she couldn't name. "You'll stay here," he said. "Hakjin. Not as a favor." His voice hadn't changed in volume or temperature, but there was something underneath it now that she felt rather than heard. "I'm not offering you charity. I'm telling you you're not going back out there." Charlotte set the bowl down. She turned to look at him fully, because this felt like the kind of conversation that required it. His face was exactly what it always was, composed, unreadable in the way that was somehow more expressive than most people's full emotional range. But his eyes were doing something. She couldn't name it precisely. She only knew that whatever it was, it had been there since he'd stepped out of that lobby and found her on the pavement, and it hadn't gone anywhere. "How did you even know I was out there?" she asked. He held her gaze. "I have people. Your guard told you." "Yes." "And you just came down?" "Yes." Something about the simplicity of it undid her a little. Not the answer itself, but the speed of it. The absence of deliberation. Like the decision had already been made well before the question existed. "I can be gone by morning," she said, because she needed to say it. Needed him to know she was not someone who dissolved into dependency at the first sign of difficulty. "I just need tonight." Hakjin looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood, picked up her duffel bag from near the entrance, and carried it down the hall without a word. She heard a door open, the quiet sound of a light being turned on. She sat there in the living room with the city glowing behind the glass, and thought about how his face had looked when he said, "I'm not offering you charity." The particular tightness in it, the thing that moved behind his eyes that he hadn't bothered to hide. Not completely, anyway. She was still thinking about it when she finally stood and followed the light down the hall. She slept better than she had any right to. That was the first thought Charlotte had when she opened her eyes to an unfamiliar ceiling. White, clean, the morning light coming in at an angle through curtains she hadn't closed all the way the night before. For exactly 3 seconds she didn't remember where she was. Then the duffel bag in the corner of the room brought everything back, and the 3 seconds of peace dissolved into the full weight of her situation, pressing down on her chest like something physical. She lay still for a moment, listening. The apartment was quiet in a specific way, not empty, but controlled. She could hear, faintly, what might have been movement somewhere beyond the bedroom door. The smell of coffee was not imagined. She found the bathroom, washed her face, stared at herself in the mirror for longer than was useful. She looked tired, in the way that a single good night of sleep couldn't fix. The kind of tired that had been accumulating for weeks and had simply decided to become visible all at once. She pulled her hair back, put on clean clothes from the duffel, and told herself that today she would make calls. She would be productive. She would handle this. She would not make this into something it wasn't. Hakjin was in the kitchen when she came out. He was standing at the counter with a cup of coffee, dressed already. Dark slacks, a black shirt, his neck tattoo disappearing beneath the collar. He looked like a man who had been awake for hours, which she suspected was accurate. He glanced up when she appeared in the doorway. "Coffee," he said, and it was somewhere between an offer and a statement of fact. "Please," she said. He poured it without asking how she took it, and then slid a small container of cream and a spoon across the counter toward her, which meant he had paid attention at some point. She filed that away and didn't comment on it. They stood on opposite sides of the kitchen island for a moment, and it struck her that this was one of the stranger situations she had navigated in recent memory. Drinking coffee in the apartment of a man she couldn't quite classify, wearing yesterday's clothing, with everything she currently owned sitting in a bag 20 feet away. "I'm going to call a few people this morning," she said. "A friend in Evanston, maybe a short-term rental situation. I have enough saved to cover a month somewhere decent while I sort out the job situation." She wrapped both hands around the mug. "I want you to know I have a plan." "I know you have a plan," he said. He said it without any particular inflection, which somehow made it land as both acknowledgement and gentle dismissal. Like, yes, you have a plan, and also, I'm not concerned about the plan. Then why do you look like that? He raised an eyebrow, barely. Like what? Like I've said something you've already decided isn't going to happen. A pause. He turned and picked up his own coffee. "I have a meeting this morning. There's food in the refrigerator. You can use the desk in the second room if you need to work." He said it easily, like they had already negotiated terms she hadn't been present for. "We'll talk tonight." Charlotte opened her mouth. Charlotte, just her name, quiet and exact. "Eat something first." She closed her mouth. She hated that it worked. He left 40 minutes later with a man she recognized from the night before. Not the one with the scar, a different one, younger, who waited near the elevator with the particular posture of someone whose entire job was to be alert and unobtrusive simultaneously. Hakjin paused at the door and looked back at her once, briefly, and she couldn't read the look precisely, but it settled on her skin like a hand placed carefully on a shoulder. Then he was gone, and she was alone in his apartment with her coffee and her plan. She made calls. The friend in Evanston, Priya, who she'd known since college, was warm and immediately distressed on Charlotte's behalf and offered her couch without hesitation. It was a real option. Charlotte wrote it down and told herself she would take it. She called 2 staffing agencies and sent updated resumes to 3 event management firms she'd been watching for openings. By 11 in the morning, she had done everything productive she could think of to do. And then she sat at the desk in the spare room and stared at the city through the window and tried to figure out what exactly was happening to her. Not professionally. She understood that part, more or less. It was a setback, painful and inconvenient, and not her fault. And she would recover from it the way she had recovered from every other thing that had tried to reduce her. She was clear on that. What she was less clear on was this apartment, this situation. The way Hakjin had come downstairs without hesitation, and the way he had said you're not going back out there like it was simply a fact he was communicating rather than a position he was taking. She had known, in the abstract, that he was not a simple man. She'd understood it from the beginning. The private rooms, the security detail, the guests at those Linden and Voss events who spoke to him with a deference that went well beyond professional courtesy. She had never asked him directly about it. He had never offered. There was an understanding between them, unspoken and slightly uncomfortable, that certain doors in his life were not hers to open. But she had always kept a part of herself at a careful distance from all of that. She had to. Because whatever she felt when he looked at her, whatever the pull of those brief, dense phone calls at midnight, she was not someone who lost herself in complicated men. She had seen what that did to people. She had made a rule of it. And yet here she was, in his apartment, in his spare room, eating his food and feeling, against every reasonable instinct, something that was uncomfortably close to safe. Hakjin returned at 4:30. He came in the way he always moved, without announcement, without noise, just a shift in the quality of the air that preceded him. Charlotte was in the living room by then, laptop open, pretending to be more absorbed in her screen than she was. He stood in the entryway and looked at her for a moment. There was something different about him. Not visibly. Nothing in his expression had changed. But the energy around him was tighter than it had been that morning. Whatever his meeting had been, it had not been casual. One of the men came in behind him, said something quietly in Korean. Hakjin responded without turning, 3 words, and the man stepped back and the door closed and they were alone. "You stayed," Hakjin said. "I said I'd be here till tonight." "You said you'd be gone by morning." Charlotte looked up from the laptop. "I had things to do." He sat down in the chair across from her. The same chair as the night before, she noticed. Like he had a specific geometry in this room that he returned to without thinking. He was quiet for a moment, and she had learned enough about his silences to know this one had something in it. "Someone came to my meeting today," he said. "Someone who mentioned your name." Charlotte went very still. "What?" "A man named Derek Voss." He watched her face. "He wanted to know if I had contact with any former Linden and Voss employees. Specifically, he wanted to know about you." The name hit her like cold water. Derek Voss, the senior partner, the one who had signed her termination letter. She had barely interacted with him directly. She couldn't imagine what she had to do with any of his concerns. "I don't understand," she said. "Why would he—" "The event in September," Hakjin said. "The Aldrich Room dinner." His voice was even, but there was something underneath it that she felt like pressure. There were documents handled through that event, logistics coordination, vendor contracts that contained routing information they were not supposed to contain. Charlotte stared at him. "I processed the vendor paperwork. That was part of my job. I didn't—" "I know." 2 words, and the certainty in them was absolute. "You didn't know what you were handling, but Voss does, and now he's trying to determine how much you saw." The room felt smaller than it had a moment ago. Charlotte closed her laptop slowly. She thought about the termination that had come so suddenly, the 2 weeks severance, the form she'd signed without questioning. She thought about the efficiency of it, how cleanly and quickly she had been removed. She had attributed it to the restructuring. She had not looked for another explanation. She looked for one now, and it arrived fully formed and cold in the pit of her stomach. "He had me fired," she said. It wasn't a question. Hakjin said nothing, which was answer enough. Charlotte sat with that for a moment. The anger arrived quietly, which was how her real anger always came. Not loud, not immediate, but thorough. It filled her evenly, edge to edge, like water finding its level. "What does he want?" she asked. "To know if you're a liability." Hakjin's voice hadn't changed at all. "And to determine who you've been in contact with since leaving the firm." The implication of that settled over her like a shadow. She understood, with a clarity that was slightly nauseating, that her being in this apartment was not going to look like coincidence to a man like Derek Voss. "I have to leave," she said. "If he connects me to you—" "Charlotte." "It makes everything worse for both of us. I'm not going to—" "Charlotte." Quieter this time, the kind of quiet that required her full attention. She stopped. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the careful composure, not the almost warmth. Something more direct than either. "You are not leaving this apartment tonight." She felt the words land somewhere deeper than she expected. "And tomorrow?" she asked, because she needed to hear it. His jaw shifted just slightly. "Tomorrow we deal with Voss." She didn't sleep well that night. Not because the bed was uncomfortable. It wasn't. It was unreasonably comfortable. The kind of mattress that suggested someone had spent real money on the idea of rest. It was the information that wouldn't settle. She lay in the dark and turned it over and over the way you turn something sharp between your fingers, careful and compulsive at once. Derek Voss. The Aldrich Room. The vendor contracts she had processed without a second thought, because processing vendor contracts was her job, because she had been efficient and thorough and had asked no questions she wasn't supposed to ask. She thought about the form she'd signed on that Tuesday afternoon that smelled like burnt coffee. The severance, the speed of it all. She had been removed the way you remove a variable from an equation, quickly, cleanly, before it could affect the outcome. Around 2 a.m, she gave up on sleep and sat at the edge of the bed in the dark, and she thought about the fact that somewhere on the other side of the wall, Hakjin was either awake or sleeping with the particular stillness of a man who had made his peace with the weight of the world he lived in. She thought about what it meant that she was here, inside that world, and what it was going to cost her, and whether the cost had already been incurred without her consent somewhere back in September, when she'd stood in a side corridor of the Aldrich Room, holding a clipboard, and felt his eyes find her face with that impossible precision. She was still sitting on the edge of the bed when she heard, faintly, the sound of his voice from somewhere in the apartment. Low, in Korean, measured. A phone call at 2 a.m. that didn't sound like it was the first one. She didn't move. She sat in the dark and listened to the cadence of words she couldn't understand, and thought that this was the part of him she had never been allowed to see. Not the restaurants and the dinners and the quiet conversations, but this. The machinery of whatever he actually was, running in the hours when ordinary people were asleep. At some point, the voice stopped. A few minutes later, there was a quiet knock on the bedroom door. Not urgent, just present. She got up and opened it. He was leaning against the hallway wall, phone in his hand, shirt untucked, looking like a man who had also not been sleeping. He looked at her without surprise, which meant he'd known she was awake, which meant she was still getting used to the particular unsettling quality of his awareness. "You should sleep," he said. "You should too," she said. Something passed across his face that might have been, in different lighting, the beginning of a smile. He pushed off the wall. "Voss is moving faster than I expected. I need to handle some things tomorrow that can't wait." He looked at her directly. "I need you to stay inside." Charlotte crossed her arms. "You need me to stay inside." "Yes." "Like, in this apartment. All day." "Yes." "Hakjin, I have things to—" "I know." He said it without impatience, which was somehow more difficult to argue with than impatience would have been. "One day. I need one day to put something in place. And then this is over." She studied his face. "What does over mean, exactly, for someone like you?" He held her gaze. "It means Voss won't have a reason to look for you anymore." "That's not an explanation." "No," he agreed. "It's not." The hallway was narrow, and the lamp from the living room was throwing a low warm light that caught the edge of his jaw, the ink at his collar. She thought about pressing harder, asking the specific question she had been carefully not asking for 4 months. "Who are you, really? What is all of this? What am I standing in the middle of?" She thought about how the answer would change things, whether she was ready for it too. "One day," she said. He nodded. She went back to bed. She didn't sleep particularly well, but she slept. In the morning he was already gone, but this time there was a note on the kitchen counter. Not an elaborate one, just her name written at the top in handwriting that was clean and precise and somehow exactly what she would have expected, followed by, "Food in the refrigerator. Junho will be outside the door if you need anything. Don't open it for anyone else." Junho, she discovered when she cracked the door briefly out of sheer curiosity, was the man with the scar, He nodded at her with the serene impassivity of someone doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing. She nodded back. She closed the door. She spent the morning doing what she could from inside. More job applications. A long call with Priya, who was audibly worried and asked 3 times if Charlotte was okay, and received 3 answers that were technically true if somewhat incomplete. She did not mention where she was staying. She did not mention Hak Jin. She wasn't sure how to explain him to someone who existed in the ordinary world, in the world of normal variables and predictable risks. At noon, she found herself standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the street 14 floors below, and trying to locate, among the ordinary midday movement of the city, anything that felt wrong. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for. She knew she was looking. Hak Jin called it too. She picked up on the second ring. "You're inside," he said, and it was not a question. "I'm inside," she confirmed. "Good." A pause. The sound of somewhere busy behind him. Not street noise, something more interior. "How are you?" Charlotte turned away from the window. "You're asking me how I am?" "Yes." "In the middle of whatever you're doing?" "Yes." The same tone. Patient, slightly immovable. She sat down on the couch. "I'm fine. I'm anxious and I don't like not knowing what's happening, but I'm fine." She paused. "How are you?" A brief silence that had a texture to it. "I'll be back by 7. That's not an answer. "No," he said. "It's not." After the call, she sat for a moment with the phone in her hand and thought about the specific way he had asked how she was. Not perfunctory, not transitional, but with that weight he put behind small things sometimes, like he meant them more than the word suggested. She thought about that for longer than was useful. He came back at 6:40. She heard the keypad, heard the door, heard the quiet exchange with Junho in the hallway before it closed. When he came into the living room, he looked like a man who had done significant things in the past several hours and had arrived on the other side of them intact. He sat down. She waited. "Voss had documentation," he said. "Evidence he believed connected your logistics work to a financial channel that would have been very inconvenient for several people, myself included." He spoke evenly, like a man delivering a report. "He was planning to use it as leverage, either against you directly, to ensure your silence, or against me, through you." Charlotte felt the cold clarity of it. "And now?" "The documentation has been retrieved. The leverage doesn't exist anymore." She stared at him. She knew better than to ask how. Is he going to come after me directly? No. The certainty in it was absolute and slightly frightening. He won't. Hak Jin, he won't, Charlotte. His eyes met hers. I was very clear with him about what that would mean. She believed him. That was the thing. She believed him completely. Not because he was reassuring or warm about it, but because she had never once heard him say something he didn't mean. In 4 months, she had learned that about him. With the same certainty, you learn which way a river runs. Not dramatically, just through consistent observation. She stood up and walked to the window because she needed to move, and the apartment had finite space. The city was going gold at the edges, the sun dropping somewhere beyond the western grid. And she stood in that light and felt the weight of the week trying to recalibrate inside her. I need to ask you something, she said, without turning around. Yes. All of this, Voss, the event, the contracts, was any of it planned? Did you know who I was before the Aldrich room? Did someone put me in that room on purpose? The silence behind her had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression that was more open than anything she had seen on his face before. Not fully open, not exposed, but the guard was lower, the careful composition slightly loosened. Like the question had arrived somewhere underneath the usual architecture of him. No, he said, you were not planned. She held his gaze. But when I saw you in that room, he said slowly, like someone choosing each word from a limited supply, I decided that I was going to know you. That was planned. He paused. Everything after that was mine. Charlotte felt the words settle into her like something warm dropped into cold water, the heat of them spreading unevenly, reaching places she hadn't meant to leave open. She should have said something measured, something that kept the appropriate distance. Hak Jin, she said instead. Just his name. He stood. He crossed the room in a way that wasn't fast, but felt inevitable, the way gravity feels inevitable. And he stopped directly in front of her, close enough that the warmth of him was a physical fact. He lifted one hand and tucked a strand of hair from her face with a deliberateness that made her breath do something inconvenient. You're not going to Evanston, he said quietly. She stopped. Tried again. You can't just decide that. I know. His hand stayed at the edge of her jaw, barely touching. Tell me to step back. The city burned gold behind the glass. The lamp threw its low, warm light across the floor. Charlotte did not tell him to step back. 3 weeks later, Charlotte still had a key she hadn't asked for. It had appeared on the kitchen counter one morning without ceremony or explanation. A single key on a plain black fob, sitting next to her coffee cup like it had always been there. She'd picked it up, looked at it, looked at him. He'd been reading something on his phone and hadn't looked up. She'd put the key in her pocket and said nothing, because she was learning that some things Hak Jin did were not invitations to discussion. They were simply facts he was introducing into the world, quietly, and waiting to see if the world would accept them. The world, specifically her, had accepted it. That was worth examining, and she examined it regularly, usually at night when the apartment was quiet and the city did its amber glow thing beyond the windows, and she lay in the dark thinking about how her life had rearranged itself in the span of 30 days with a thoroughness that should have alarmed her more than it did. She had a job interview on a Thursday morning, a mid-sized event firm in the West Loop, legitimate and well-reviewed, a position that was actually a step up from what she'd had at Linden and Voss. She'd found it herself, applied herself, had done the first-round phone call from the spare room while Hak Jin was out. When she told him about the in-person interview, he had looked up from whatever he was reading and said good with a quiet directness that contained, she'd come to understand, more genuine feeling than most people put into long speeches. She went to the interview alone. She'd been clear about that. Not argumentative, not a production, just calm and firm in the way she was capable of being when something mattered to her. She needed to walk into that building as herself, not as someone accompanied, not as someone under protection. She needed to know that whatever she was building now, she was building it with her own hands. Hak Jin had said nothing, but Junho had been parked half a block from the building, and she had pretended not to notice, and he had pretended not to be there. And they had maintained this polite fiction because some compromises she was learning were the shape that care took in a life like his. She got the job. She called him from the sidewalk outside the building, wind in her hair, November now and properly cold, the kind of cold that was honest about itself. He picked up on the first ring. I got it, she said. A pause. Then, I know. She stopped walking. What do you mean you know? Junho texted me when you came out smiling. Charlotte stood on the sidewalk and laughed. Actually laughed, the unexpected kind that comes from somewhere unguarded, and heard, on the other end of the line, something that was almost certainly Hak Jin doing the same, or as close as he ever came to it. That quiet exhale, that fractional shift in his breath that she had learned to read, the way you learn to read weather in a place you've lived long enough. That's a violation of my privacy, she said. Yes, he agreed pleasantly. She shook her head and walked toward the parking structure where she'd left her car, which she'd retrieved from Marcus's building with no drama, and which now lived in Hawk Jean's building's garage on the assumption, apparently, that she did too. "I'll be back by 6. I'll be here," he said, and hung up. She had asked him, one evening in early November, to tell her something real about himself. They'd been sitting in the kitchen after dinner. She'd cooked, which had surprised him. She could tell by the specific quality of his attention while she moved around his kitchen, like she'd been doing it for years. They were having the kind of quiet that had become comfortable between them, and she'd looked up from her wine and said it plainly. "Tell me something real." He'd looked at her for a long moment. "My father ran the organization before me," he said. "He came to the United States when he was 22. He built everything here from nothing, which is a sentence people say about all kinds of things. But for him, it was literally true." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "He died when I was 24. There was no transition plan. There was just everything he'd built, and me, and the expectation that I would hold it." Charlotte hadn't spoken. She'd known instinctively that this required stillness. "I've been holding it for 6 years, he said. "I'm good at it. I don't always like it." He looked up at her. "That's real." She'd reached across the counter and put her hand over his, briefly. He'd turned his hand over and held hers, and they'd sat like that for a while without speaking, and it had been one of the most honest moments she'd ever shared with another person. She thought about that evening now, often. The thing about Derek Voss resolved itself in a way she never fully got the details of, and eventually stopped trying to. What she knew was that 2 weeks after Hawk Jean had described retrieving documentation and being very clear about consequences, Voss had announced his retirement from Linden and Voss, effective immediately, citing personal health reasons. The remaining partners had issued a brief statement. The firm had restructured again, differently this time. She didn't ask Hawk Jean what had happened specifically. She asked once if Voss was okay, meaning alive, meaning physically unharmed. And Hawk Jean had looked at her with something that was steady and direct, and said yes without any accompanying darkness, and she believed him. And she let it rest there. She was not going to be naive about the world she had stepped into. But she was also not going to construct a version of him that was entirely shadow. The man who had come downstairs at midnight because a guard had whispered that she'd been sleeping outside. That was also real. Both things lived in the same person, and she had decided, with the clear-eyed practicality that was probably her most defining quality, that she could hold that. On a Saturday morning in mid-November, she woke up to gray light and the smell of coffee already made, which meant he'd been up for a while, which was usual. She lay in bed for a moment, his bed now, because the spare room had gradually become a fiction neither of them maintained, and listened to the city outside and the particular silence of the apartment that had stopped feeling unfamiliar. She found him at the kitchen counter with his phone and his coffee, exactly where she expected him to be. He looked up when she came in. "There's something I want to ask you," she said. He set his phone down. He gave her his full attention, which was one of the things about him. When he looked at you, he looked at you completely. No division of focus, no half-presence. It could be overwhelming if you weren't used to it. "What are we?" she said. "I want to hear you say it." A pause. Not the kind that suggested uncertainty. He was not, she had learned, a man who felt uncertain often. This was the kind of pause that meant he was choosing words with care, which was its own form of respect. "Mine," he said. "You're mine." Charlotte looked at him. She thought about saying that was not a complete answer. She thought about pointing out that it was somewhat possessive as a declaration. She thought about the key on the black fob in her jacket pocket, and the way he'd looked when she'd called him from the sidewalk, and the way he held her hand in the kitchen that night, like it was something he intended to keep doing. "And you?" she asked. Something shifted in his face. That rare thing, the lowered guard, the openness she'd only seen a handful of times. "Yours," he said, like it was obvious, like it had been decided in some room she hadn't been in, long before tonight, and the decision had been final. Charlotte picked up her coffee cup. She looked at him over the rim of it for a moment. This complicated, careful, impossible man who had come downstairs in the cold and carried her bag and left a key without explanation, and called from the middle of his dangerous life to ask how she was. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated, and the almost smile appeared, the real one. The one she'd learned to wait for because it meant something when it came. She sat down at the kitchen counter beside him, close enough that their arms touched. And outside the windows, Chicago was gray and cold and indifferent the way it always was, and the coffee was good, and the key was in her pocket, and Charlotte thought that this, all of it, the weight and the warmth and the complicated truth of it, was hers too. She had stopped waiting for it to feel like a mistake. It didn't.